we've got a story coming from the book of 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 11. Now, what we have up until this point is that David has become king of Israel, and he's been doing a great job. All along, he had been trying to follow God the best he could, and even though there were times when his anger might get away from him, he's been able to avoid major sin. Um, Now we see a change in David, and it's a little bit disturbing because up until this time, we've seen that he has been doing a good job, but it all starts when the spring of the year comes around and his army goes out to war, but he does not go with them. Now, what you need to know about this is that springtime was common in that time and that place for the kings of the different nations to go out and fight their battles, either to drive back someone who was a threat or to conquer new territory. In this case, the Israelites were fighting against the Ammonites, and that was one of the groups of people that God had wanted driven out of the promised land or destroyed. And so Israel does the right thing by sending their army out to fight them, but David doesn't go with them. And that's unusual for the kings not to go with their armies and to be an example to the men and to lead the men. But he stays at home and he's in his palace and he's kind of wandering around. It says that he gets up from bed and he's wandering around in the evening. So he's sleeping during the day and he's not with the army and he seems to have nothing to do. And there's an old saying, you don't hear much anymore, about idle hands are the devil's playthings. And that means that if you don't find something to engage in, something to work on, especially something positive, of course, then somehow you will find temptation and trouble. And that's what happens here. David is on the roof of the palace, and that was pretty common. They had flat roofs for the buildings, like homes, and the palace is just a large version of a home. And people would use that, especially in the heat of the day. They would perhaps be inside the house in the shade, but once the sun went down, it was cooler to go up onto the roof. He's on the roof. He's looking around. He sees this woman named Bathsheba, and he knows this is a beautiful woman. And he asks someone to find out who that is. And they find out and they said, oh, that's Bathsheba. She's married to Uriah the Hittite. Well, David would have known Uriah the Hittite because in David's army, there were 30 what you would call mighty men. These were exceptionally good soldiers. And they are ones that David could trust with anything, and Uriah is one of them, even though he is a Hittite. And I mentioned that because the Hittites were one of those groups of people God wanted driven out of the promised land, yet Uriah is a Hittite. He's not Jewish. So he must have done something remarkable to have become so close to David and in a position of authority. In fact, he may have become Jewish in his faith, even though he was a Hittite in his heritage. Anyway, David now knows that this woman, as beautiful as she is off limits because she's married. But he sends messengers to invite her to the palace. Okay, that was not proper, but she goes because when the king requests your presence, you have to go. Well, then later on, after she's been with him, she's returned home, she finally sends a message and tells David that she's going to have a baby. The trouble is, it's David's baby. It's not Uriah's. And David realizes, uh-oh, this is a problem. Rather than realizing that he has committed sin he has caused someone else to commit sin, he begins to try to hide what he's done. So he sends a message to Joab, the leader of the army, you would call him the head general, to say, send Uriah the Hittite to me. Now, Uriah comes in and he presents himself to David, and David asks about how things are going with the battle and the fighting, and Uriah tells him, and David says, okay, you've done well. You go home to your wife, and tomorrow I'll send you back. Well, Uriah does not go back to Bathsheba. He stays with the servants. And you kind of wonder, that seems a little bit strange. But when David asked him about it, he says, well, my fellow soldiers are living in the field and they don't get to be with their wives, so I'm not going to take that advantage for myself. I wouldn't want them to do anything that's improper, and I won't do this because it would be improper. So David says, well, hang on a second. I'm going to have a message I need you to take back with you to Joab. But meanwhile, you can stay the night. Well, that night, David adds to his sin by getting Uriah to drink more than he should, and Uriah doesn't really have a clear mind in all things. However, he still does not go back to his wife. He stays with the servants. So David says, okay, I'm just going to have Uriah killed. And so he sends a message that Uriah takes back to Joab and pretty much says, I need to have Uriah killed, so have the men of the army get close to the wall of the Ammonites, and then have the army pull back, leaving him alone, and he'll be killed. Well, Joab does this, and Uriah is killed along with some other Israelites, and he sends a message back to David saying that, okay, we've been fighting, and he really goes into detail about what's been going on, and then he adds, and Uriah, your servant, has been killed. Well, David then waits until the end of the morning time for Bathsheba to have for her husband, and then he brings her into the palace and marries her. Now, he's already gotten some other wives, but now he has her as well. And things seem to be okay. And then the child is born, and it's a boy. About that time, Nathan the prophet comes and visits David and says, I have a story for you. And that was not unusual. A lot of times they would have news to tell, and they would place it in the form of a story for the kings. And David's listening, and Nathan says, there was this rich man who had a lot of sheep and cattle, and there was a poor man who lived nearby who had just one sheep, and he had raised it from when it was little, and he had fed it from his own table, and it was just like one of the family. But then the rich man had a guest come in, and rather than use one of his own sheep, he took the poor man's sheep and prepared it as a meal for his guest. Well, David saw that, he's not just telling a story, he's telling something about a real person. He may have even thought that Nathan was giving him a story to get his reaction on how it should be settled. And David says, this man is not worth living. He must pay back 4 times what he has done. Nathan turns to David and says, you're the man. See, the secret is out. God had told Nathan what David had done. Nathan presented the story in a way to get David's true judgment of what David had done. And David immediately confesses his sin and admits that he had done wrong. And Nathan says, well, God has forgiven you of your sin, but there are consequences to your sin. And there's going to be constant fighting and war in your family, and the son who was just born to you is going to die. Well, David is really upset about that, and he begins to fast, meaning he's not eating, and he's crying, he's praying to God, and he does this day after day. And on the seventh day of this child, the baby dies. And we look at this and we go, oh, this isn't fair. You know, the baby didn't do anything wrong. Why did he have to die? Well, what we have to understand in this is that when people do bad things, innocent people can be hurt. And this is the case with this baby. Now, the baby dies. So where's the baby go? The baby goes to heaven. So it works out well for the baby, the little boy. But David has to live with this the rest of his life. And that's some of the other consequences of sin, of disobeying God, is that we remember what we've done, and it's bad for us. And we are reminded of the things we have done. Now, the best thing is that we can hope that we will learn from this so that we don't do other bad things. And in this case, what David does seems odd to people. As soon as he finds out the baby has died, he cleans himself up. He gets something to eat. He starts acting normal, and people ask, why aren't you in mourning? And why did you stop your fasting? And he says, well, while the baby was alive, I thought maybe God will change his mind and let him live. But he's not going to come back from being dead. One day I'll be dead and I'll be back with him. But there's nothing else I can do. And so, we understand that. The people now understood what he had to say. And as an end result of this, we do find that the Israelite army wins the battle and takes the major city of the Ammonites. But there's another victory in this, and it's won with a tough lesson, is that when we disobey God, when we do evil things, it affects people. It affects not just us, and it may affect us for life, but it affects other people and may cause them a lot of pain. So that's the thing we can learn from this lesson. For my tie today, I wore this one, and this is to represent Uriah the Hittite, who had fought for David and was faithful to David even when David was not faithful to him. Okay, with that, I'm going to let you go, and hope this has given you something to think about, because David was many considered the greatest of people following God, and he ends up returning to follow God even though he has stumbled. So remember, there's always a way to turn back to God. There's always time to turn back and do what is right. All right? Hope to see you next time. Bye.